Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. Thank you for joining us today. Today I'm excited about our presentation with Dr. Kevin Robertson, director of the Fire Ecology program at Tall Timbers Research Station. Today, Dr. Robertson will be giving a presentation that will seek to build a foundation for understanding prescribed fire. At this point, I would like to welcome Mr. Scott Davis from the EPA, Chief of Air Planning and Implementation for EPA Region 4, based in Atlanta.
Yeah, thanks, David, and to Southern Fire Exchange for hosting today. And also a big thank you to Kevin for presenting today and for all the good work that's being done at Tall Timbers Research Station as well as with the Southern Fire Exchange. As David said, I'm Scott Davis. I'm Chief of our Air Planning and Implementation branch here with EPA in our Southeast Regional Office located in Atlanta. I do want to first off give a big welcome to all our environmental partners from across the Southeast, including our state, local, and tribal agencies, as well as the Department of Defense and military-based representatives who are on today, and the other participants that we have from across the country. A huge crowd, as David said, so we're glad you can be on today. Just wanted to give everybody just a real quick update on our host, which is the Southeast Prescribed Fire and Air Quality Workgroup. This particular group was formed in 2013, and it consists of the state air directors, the state forestry and fire chiefs, and some other regional partners from our 8 southeastern states. We did kick it off, as I said, in 2013. We had a smoke management summit down in Itchway, Georgia. We do get together to serve as a forum to exchange state, regional, and national prescribed fire, smoke management, and air quality goals and issues. And we also identify regional prescribed fire and air quality coordination needs and solutions. We do have quarterly calls, and every 2 years we get together for what we call smoke summits. Our most recent one was in 2019, and our next one is coming up in 2021. It has been an excellent forum to bring together folks that are concerned about prescribed fire and air quality in the Southeast, and we welcome anybody that wants to contact us for further information about how our group formed and how we've been successful over the last 8 years. Big thanks to our workgroup planning team, Mark Melvin from the Jones Center at Itchway, Mike Zupko from the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, Jen Fawcett from North Carolina State University Extension Office, and then my colleague Rick Gillum at EPA Region 4. So thanks again, David and Kevin, and I'll turn it back over to you all.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's been a great partnership working with the folks in the Southeast Prescribed Fire and Air Quality Working Group, and we really appreciate the partnership that we have with y'all. I'd like to take just a quick moment to share a little bit of information about our program, the Southern Fire Exchange. SFE is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast. We're a collaborative among the University of Florida, Tall Timbers Research Station, North Carolina State University, and the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station. We're sponsored by the federally funded Joint Fire Science Program, and we are the southeastern branch of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network. Working with our network of partners, we develop programs, opportunities, and events that bridge the divide between the fire science and natural resource management communities. We have over 70 of our past fire science and management webinars recorded and posted to our YouTube webinar archive. So if this is the first time that you have joined us, welcome. And if you are looking for additional webinars and programs similar to what you'll see today, be sure to head over to that webinar archive on YouTube. These are great recordings for courses, for professional development, and for RT 130 classes as well. And finally, if you're joining us today from an area outside of the Southeastern U.S., please do look into connecting with your local Fire Science Exchange Network. These are the folks that are working to connect regional managers and researchers to address local fire science issues and make differences on the ground. You can go to firescience.gov for more information to pull up that map and to connect with your local exchange. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Kevin Robertson received his BS in botany from Louisiana State University and Ph.D. in plant biology at the University of Illinois. He is currently the Fire Ecology Program Director at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy in Tallahassee, Florida. There he studies the plant community ecology of southeastern U.S. pine ecosystems, the natural history of the Gulf coastal plain, remote sensing of fire, effects of fire regime on plant communities, soils, and fire behavior, and prescribed fire effects on air quality. He also provides extension and education regarding the use of prescribed burning in fire-dependent ecosystems in the southeastern U.S. And he's also a co-PI and key member of our Southern Fire Exchange leadership team. So with that, welcome, Kevin. So excited to have you with us today, and welcome everybody on the line. And one moment, please, as we trade out presentations.
So I'll start with the basics here about what is prescribed fire. And prescribed fire could be primarily defined by these factors. It's a careful, intentional application of fire to vegetative fuels. It's constrained by a written prescription that specifies acceptable environmental conditions for the burn. It has specific land management objectives that are stated in that prescription. It's confined to a planned fire area, and it specifies precautionary measures and contingencies for safety to keep the fire in, and it's authorized and regulated by state and local laws and regulations to varying degrees depending on what state you're in. Today I'll focus mostly on the southeastern coastal plain, which is typically the focus of the Southern Fire Exchange. So why prescribe fire? Well, first of all, fire's been with us for a long time. Fire and fire-dependent ecosystems have dominated much of the southeastern U.S. landscape for millennia, taking a break in between glaciations, but even between them in the past, we've seen that there are fire-dependent ecosystems from pollen cores and lakes and the like. Fires have been started by lightning, which is very common in the South and abundant, especially in Florida, and humans who lit fires frequently for lots of different reasons, from keeping the ticks down to hunting to seeing enemies, et cetera, et cetera. We have insights into historic fire regimes. First of all, just from the requirements of native plants and animals, we know that a wide range of plants and animals will start to disappear rather quickly as soon as we stop burning in a lot of southern ecosystems. And just as an example is the Bachman sparrow, which research by Jim Cox at Tall Timbers has shown vacates the area within about 18 months following a prescribed fire, just kind of underscoring how often fires have to occur in longleaf pine ecosystems as an example. Fire scars from old stumps give us some insights as well. And here's a fire showing fire scars from an old stump that was cut at Tyndall Air Force Base. Our program here is doing some research in dendrochronology. Some of these stumps go back to the 1400s, and we're working on those publications. So fires cannot be allowed to spread across landscapes today. Once upon a time, when there weren't roads and parking lots and all sorts of different barriers to fire, fire could have spread a long way, and fire is probably pretty common throughout the landscape. But now it has to be applied locally and intentionally, and of course it has to be contained into an area that we determine ahead of time. The prescribed fire is used to maintain or restore native communities that depend on fire. The main thing that fire does in most fire-dependent communities in the Southeast is top kill vegetation. When I say top kill, I mean it kills the top of the plant, but not the root system, and so most of the plants resprout in most of these ecosystems. Broadleaf woody plants in particular are important objective for top killing, because if we don't top kill them, they very quickly begin to become a closed canopy hardwood forest, which corresponds to the loss of the herbaceous plant species biodiversity and the habitat for many animals and the plants of special concern in the Southeast. So it's really kind of akin to mowing the grass. You don't mow the grass to kill the grass, but you mow it to maintain the system at a certain state. And the plants just continue to grow and resprout. Here's just an example of a photo series at Pebble Hill plantation in southern Georgia. This is 1 year post-fire in a longleaf pine savanna, and then 2 years in the same location. You see the broadleaf woody plants starting to get bigger, and then 3 years they're getting bigger, and 4 years post-fire, 5 years post-fire, growing, 6 years post-fire, getting hard to see across the unit. And then we apply a prescribed fire, and you can see it top kills most of the woody plants, as well as the herbaceous plants, which are also perennial for the most part, and for the most part resprout, although some of them die. And then they resprout again, and this is 2 years after that fire. In 2019, we're back to an herb-dominated community like it was before, with the woody plants growing once again. But you see why we have to burn so often, and we're not recommending a 6-year fire return interval for longleaf pine savannas. We usually burn them at a 2-year fire interval or 1 to 3 year fire interval. But this is just some research plots showing why we burn so often. So what happens in these systems when you take fire out of them? These are a couple of photographs on Tall Timbers Research Station in 1966 on a hilltop where there had been 1 to 2 year fire return intervals being applied to an old field loblolly pine, shortleaf pine savanna, and then fire was taken out of it at that time in the same place in 2001. You can see it's a closed canopy hardwood forest, again underscoring why we burn so often. In this photograph at the right would be a complete habitat change for almost all of the animal species of special concern in this area. And you can see all the ground cover is pretty much just leaves. So we've lost probably 80 to 90% of the herbaceous plant diversity as well. Now, some plants in scrub communities, in particular in the Southeast, that have stand replacing fires only reproduce by seed. So I put this in as an important exception to the resprouting regime. Certain plants they're actually serotinous, so once you burn them, it opens up seed capsules for regeneration by seed. For example, the coastal scrub in Lake Rails Ridge Scrub. This is a picture from Archibald Biological Station. So why is prescribed fire important to people? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One is biodiversity and aesthetics. We care about the habitat for rare and declining species and plant biodiversity and insect diversity and all those things. Wildlife management is real important for species, for game species such as the northern bobwhite, which is entirely dependent on frequent fire. Of course, managing particular species of special concern, which might require certain adjustments to fire regime, as well as adjustments to other management practices such as timber management, etc. Fuel reduction and wildfire mitigation, of course, is a very important purpose for prescribed burning. And a lot of the burning that's applied by state forestry agencies have this as their primary objective. If an area is burned frequently and you minimize the fuel in those areas, then it'll also minimize the fire behavior if there's a wildfire in that area, make it easy to stop. And there are many anecdotal cases in which wildfires have been spreading pretty much out of control until they hit an area where a prescribed fire had been applied relatively recently, and then it was either stopped or was just easily put out. Air quality management kind of goes hand in glove with wildfire management, because if there's prescribed fires are applied frequently, then the fuel loads are kept low, and therefore the smoke emissions are kept to a low rate and a low volume as well, relative to a wildfire event that might occur if we weren't prescribed burning, where very large amounts of smoke can be released in a short period of time, and of course can be a major threat to the air quality to human populations. So it's kind of like an insurance policy in a way. I mean, over time, probably more smoke would be released cumulatively by doing frequent prescribed burns, but it's less smoke at any given time. So we think of it as kind of an insurance policy where you pay a little bit every year to prevent a major disaster. Forestry uses prescribed fire a lot for reducing the competition with pine trees in particular of interest, usually pine trees. The longleaf pine plantation here depends pretty heavily on frequent fire, both for regeneration of longleaf and the prevention of competition from other broadleaf hardwood species. We're learning more and more that frequent fire also assists with carbon sequestration in the soil. Frequent fire, for various reasons that we're still researching, results in an increase in soil carbon in the soil, and can also be used for restoration of microbial communities. We're working on a study right now based on a chronosequence approach to restoring prescribed fire to post-agricultural areas and showing how both carbon as well as the species composition or the DNA composition of microbes becomes increasingly restored to native conditions over time, as long as you're applying fire. It's becoming increasingly understood how fire is important for hydrological management as well. For example, longleaf pine savannas or just pine savannas in general that are frequently applied with prescribed fire are thought to be the most efficient with water. They have very high water use efficiencies, meaning they produce a lot of biomass relative to the amount of water that's used or transpired. And so a larger amount of the water goes to the aquifer and is able to feed water bodies instead of simply being evaporated or transpired. And having an open and herb and shrub dominated system that's maintained by fire can assist with that, as it contrasted with a closed canopy hardwood forest, which is very water greedy and transpires a lot of water. And it can really be noticed in the amount of water that's available in water bodies. Prescribed fire is very important for plant diversity and the pollinators that depend on them. Many flowering species in the coastal plain depend on fire to induce flowering, or they depend on open habitats that are maintained by fire in order to reproduce and provide flowers. And so the pollinators that are maintained in these frequently burned areas are also important agricultural crops, and just maintaining a native community of pollinators that are stable and can be depended on. Important for range management, and this was the main use of fire for a couple of centuries, really leading up to the 20th century in the Southeast. The people lit the piney woods or the open prairies in Florida and other southeastern states every winter to green up the grass for cattle. And this is still done in certain places in like southern Florida, for example, and southern Mississippi, where fire helps to reduce competition from broadleaf forbs and woody plants and promotes grass for cattle forage. So there are other reasons that prescribed fire is important, but those are some of the main ones. So we'll talk a little bit more about how prescribed fire is done. Well, first of all, as its name implies, it requires a prescription. And a prescription has a lot of important information on it that sets the parameters under which the fire can be set, under which the fire should be maintained, how it should be stopped, and provision for safety, many other things that are mostly listed here. So the prescription has on it who is going to be the burn boss, the person who is responsible for the burn. Also, it records the authorization from the state forestry agency that is required in most states. It has who is going to be notified about the burn, has the description and location of the area to be burned, safety and contingencies, what are the objectives of the burn, the desired fire effects, what are the acceptable weather for the burn and during the burn, and how is smoke going to be managed during the burn. It specifies acceptable fire behavior and also outlines the ignition techniques that are going to be used, how the fire is going to be stopped, and how the smoke will be stopped, or what we call mop up. And also it provides for observations to be made during the burn. And we're going to use this list of items that make up the prescription as the outline for most of the rest of the talk. Not everything that we'll talk about is necessarily on the prescription, but they're things that might be covered in a crew briefing or required by legislation, etc. So first of all, burn boss. The burn boss is responsible for the burn and its execution. So this is an important person. They're the ones who put their signature on the prescription after they get a notification from the state agency, and they're taking responsibility for what happens at that point. They can be certified for additional liability protection in most southern states if they have a Prescribed Fire Act, like the one that was initially legislated in Florida in 1990, and other southern states kind of copied more or less, to provide. The purpose of the Prescribed Fire Acts was to make it easier in a way to do prescribed burning, because the states recognize that prescribed fire is a public benefit for all the reasons that we've talked about. And so if a person is certified by the state, then it gives them liability protection if something were to go wrong. And if they were doing everything like they're supposed to be doing, including having a prescription, following the prescription, it gives them protection from civil liability. So authorization, it's legally required in most states. You have to let the state forestry agency know that you're burning. It's obtained from the state forestry agency typically, and it's granted based on criteria that are set according to those particular states and the agencies, including things like weather, what they project the smoke to do. For example, in Florida, they use high split as a smoke spread modeling software that they run before giving out an authorization to see what the smoke is going to do, and also how all the different authorizations they're giving out, how they're going to collectively influence smoke in the region. And they use that as part of their criteria for giving out authorizations to burn, or burn permits as they're often called. It's based on personnel and equipment. They'll often ask, how many people do you have? What kind of equipment do you have? So they can assess whether or not you're going to be able to do the burn safely. The number of others burning. So if you're late on the list of people calling in, they might turn you down if they feel like too much smoke is being produced, or there's too much fire that they feel like they could manage if there were escapes. So the agency's capacity to manage escape prescribed fires is a criteria for giving out the prescriptions, because if, for example, they have a lot of wildfires going on and their staff is all out fighting those, they might not feel comfortable adding more fire to the ground and having to worry about those if there are escapes. And other factors depending on particular states and localities. So notifications need to be made often. Landowner, for example. It's always a good idea for the landowner to know that you're burning their land. That's pretty much a requirement. Neighbors, it's always a good idea to let the people who might be influenced by the fire, who might even just see the fire and worry about the fire, know that you're going to conduct a prescribed burn. Fire departments, law enforcement, whoever needs to know about the fire to prevent people being concerned, or people, calling the fire department when it's really just a prescribed burn, etc., depending on the situation, where the fire's occurring and who it might impact. So the description of the area to be burned is, again, always part of a prescription. And so it always includes a map of the unit. Geographic coordinates are something that need to be provided to the state agencies in most states, either a lat long or UTM coordinates, or just a description of where you're on the map while they're looking at Google Maps or something, so they can drop a point or make a note as to where the fire is occurring. And states including Florida and Georgia, North Carolina, a few others keep records of where the burns are occurring, which is useful for a lot of different things. What fuel types you're burning, of course they want to know that, so that helps them with their smoke modeling and knowing how hard it's going to be for you to contain the burn. Fuel types include like different natural community types, and people giving out the authorizations have some idea about what the fire behavior and smoke production is going to be from those. The time since last fire, of course, is important for the reasons that should be clear from that photo series I showed a little while ago of how fuel accumulates over time. And depending on the community type, that has different implications for either becoming more duffy and more smoky over time, or maybe creating fuel conditions that are increasingly difficult to control. And resources requiring protection are important to have on the prescription too. In other words, there might be buildings within the unit that you need to have fire breaks around, or telephone poles, or whatever needs to have fire kept out of it. Safety and contingencies. Safety is always first. So one of the things that would be listed on a prescription, or that a burn boss certainly needs to be aware of, is what their personnel, how many personnel they have, what kind of equipment is available in terms of vehicles that have water and pumps that can be used to contain fire, to get people around on the burn, hand tools, backpack pumps for spraying water, et cetera, radios, of course, very important, and who's going to do what on the burn. What is the experience level of the crew is important to know. Fire breaks, of course, are very important, having adequate fire breaks. This is something that the agencies might ask about before they give out a prescription. Typically, fire breaks are put in by either a tractor plow or a disc harrow. Sometimes we mow and rake them, but obviously they have to be good to contain a fire. You can use natural features as fire breaks to rivers, roads, often used, etc. Safety zones need to be specified. If something goes wrong, where can you go to be away from the fire? And that always includes the black, as they call it, or the area that's already burned, and that's always talked about in crew briefings. Water sources, where can you get water to refill? Backpack pumps, vehicles carrying water, Type 6 engines, etc., in case you run out. Medical concerns, are there any medical problems with people in the crew that we need to know about? Allergies to bees or asthma, etc. Do you have a first aid kit? Are there any medics on the crew, trained personnel, CPR, etc., who you'd want to call on if there was a problem? And of course, the emergency contacts to get outside help as needed, and that's always going to include the forestry agency in case they need to be called to help contain an escape fire, maybe the local fire department, police force, etc. Personal protection equipment. We've heard a lot about PPE since the coronavirus came out, probably more than ever on the radio. For prescribed fire practitioners, what's required PPE varies according to what agency or organization you're burning for. It usually minimally includes Nomex shirt and pants, which is fire-resistant material, gloves that resist heat, and leather boots that can be used for stomping out fire and protect your feet. Also required can be helmets, fire shelters, depending on the agency, etc. There's always a crew briefing before and after a burn to make sure everybody knows their assignments, knows what the resources are, where they are, understand the unit, know how the burn's going to go down, how you're going to clean it up, etc. And communication is always very important. Who's got radios? Typically, everyone has to have a radio or has to be paired with a person with a radio. When things go wrong in prescribed burns and wildfires, it can almost always be tracked back to a problem with communication. So the burn objectives and desired fire effects, again, are always part of a prescription, including the general burn objectives. So kind of what's the overall purpose? Is it for wildlife habitat or biodiversity, fuel reduction, forestry, reduce exotics that are sensitive to fire, all the above, etc. And in any mandates or management plans, the fires being implemented to benefit the habitat of red-cockaded woodpecker, federally endangered, protected by the Endangered Species Act under a NEPA document, blah, blah, blah. That kind of thing would need to be there. And then more specific objectives. So what exactly do you want the fire to do? That can include completeness of the burn. It might be an objective to have a patchy burn, or it might be an objective to have close to 100% burned area. Top killing of woody vegetation. Do you want to top kill all of it, some of it, most of it? Crown scorch. Especially important if you care about the productivity of the trees in an area that you're burning. You might want to minimize the amount of scorching of needles, which reduces productivity and sometimes is an aesthetic concern, and can also drop a lot of pine needles that provide fuels for the next burn. Or maybe you're not so concerned. Maybe you're trying to achieve crown scorch because trees need to be pruned up a little bit and improve their vertical growth. Duff, peat, organic soil consumption, this is really important. So something that a burn boss is going to want to be knowledgeable about before conducting a burn is if there's any of this organic soil type fuels on the property, and are they available? That is to say, can they catch on fire and burn, or are they wet enough to resist fire? Because organic soil can be a real problem once it does combust, because number one, it's really hard to put out, and part of the authorization is almost always that you have to have the fire out by a certain time, often sundown or 5 o'clock in the afternoon or something, because of smoke concerns. In the evening when the sun goes down, the inversion layer goes down, the sun goes down, and you lose the lift that helps smoke to get up and away like you want it to. And so if the peat continues to burn all night, and you've got a real smoke problem because it's going to hug the ground, and then also it can just keep on burning and burning, and you can't mop it up, which might cause a reignition later. So organic soil is something that we always need to be very aware about. Prescribed fire might be conducted for promoting forage, greening up grass like we were talking about, or flowering, fruiting for wildlife. And there could be all kinds of other reasons that people are, specific reasons that people are conducting a prescribed burn. So on the prescription is always the acceptable weather conditions and provision for smoke management. And those kind of go hand in hand, because the weather is going to have a large influence on what the smoke does after it gets produced by the fire. So prescribed burn bosses typically use a spot weather hourly forecast that has a lot of detail about how weather's going to change over the course of the day so that you can plan how the fire is going to proceed accordingly. Here's kind of an example of one here on the right that's provided by NOAA. Wind direction is obviously important because that's where the smoke's going to go, and it's also going to influence how you do ignition techniques, where your backing fire is going to be, and head fire, how the fire is going to behave. Wind speed is important. Having enough wind so that you know what the fire is going to do is very helpful. The wind is your friend, as they often say, because it helps the predictability of fire behavior. But too much wind can also be a problem because it can increase the chances that an ember will spot over, as they say, or will go over the fire break and light up an area that's outside of the intended area to burn. Relative humidity is really important for how fine fuels combust and when they combust over the course of the day and how readily they combust. If the humidity is very, very low, it could be too low such that you have a high spotting risk. That is to say, fires can easily be started outside of the unit by an ember blowing into a dry area. Humidity could also be too high for the fire to be effective, so that's something we pay close attention to. Ambient temperature has a pretty strong influence on fire behavior, how quickly the fuels can combust, because if they're hot, they don't have to be raised as much in their temperature to combust. And it also has a strong influence on fire effects. For example, crown scorch tends to be higher if the ambient temperature is higher because, again, you don't have to raise the temperature of pine needles and leaves as much to scorch them or do damage to them. Drought indices is really important. If it's been a long time since there's rain, this influences that availability of fuel like I was talking about before, and is especially important for duff or organic soil, whether it's going to combust and cause a big problem, and whether logs, what they call 100-hour or 1,000-hour fuels, whether they combust, but because they can also continue to smoke long after the fire was supposed to be mopped up and cause smoke problems. Cloud cover is important because that influences how the fire behaves. Typically, when it's sunnier, it gives more lift to the convection columns of fires and helps the smoke get up and away where you want it to go. Mixing height is important for how high smoke can go before it hits that inversion layer. So you want that to be high enough, usually over 500 meters. That's very conservative. It should be much higher than that, really, so that you can get the smoke away from areas where it's going to impact people. And the dispersion index is is kind of combined from a lot of different measurements of weather that tell you how well the smoke is going to go up and away, again, like you want it to. Dispersion index, it's desirable for it to usually be over 30 or so. And there's something called the low visibility occurrence risk index, which is more or less the probability of smoke sticking around on the ground and causing like traffic accidents or impacting people on the ground. And you want that to be under a certain level. And find fuel moisture. And these are all things that really should be on a prescription. So you can see why prescribed burners are weather nerds and obsessive weather watchers, because all of these factors can influence the success of the burn and are necessary to be aware of for mitigating risk. There are a lot of different tools for projecting what smoke is going to do. So this is just an example of the one that's available on vSmoke Web. And it's a good idea to run these kind of models before a burn to see what the smoke's going to do and to help cover in a liability case to show that, you know, we projected what the smoke was going to do ahead of time to the best of our knowledge. So acceptable fire behavior, usually there's a range, well, there's always on the prescription a range of acceptable fire behavior in terms of flame length and rate of spread, which is how fast the fire is going to move. And it's specified for head fire, which is fire that's running with the wind, and flanking fire, that's fire spreading perpendicular to the wind, and backing fire, that's fire backing into the wind, which tends to be the lowest intensity and severity. Ignition techniques. This is also presented on a prescription. The ignition sequence is important. What are you going to light, when, and where, in what order? The direction of spread, which is influenced by the wind speed, and you know, saying whether or not the fire is going to be mostly head fire, backing fire, flanking fire, etc. Where are flames likely to converge? Because wherever flames come together, that's where you have the highest fire intensity and fire severity. This is something that you really have to have in your mind ahead of time before lighting a prescribed fire. And what fire managers are mostly doing is airflow management. We can talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but they're thinking about how the fire is going to influence the way air moves across the landscape and feeds the fire and influences fire behavior. And that's the feedback loop, in that the higher the fire intensity, the more it influences the airflow, so on and so forth. Topography has a strong influence on fire behavior as well. And so that's taken into consideration when thinking about where are you going to light, how are you going to light. Fire tends to run uphill and it tends to go more slowly downhill. And sometimes topography can overwhelm the influence of the salient wind direction. You have to be kind of aware of that. And then the spatial arrangement of fuel types and fire breaks. Different things, different areas are going to burn at different intensities in different places depending on what kind of fuel you have. And there might be natural fire breaks like a lake or a field or other things that aren't going to burn, which will influence how fire spreads across that unit. And all this has to really be thought out ahead of time before lighting the fire. So here's an example of a map of a burn that we did recently in southern Georgia, and you can see there are arrows that are showing what the ignition sequence is going to be, the names of people who are going to be lighting the fire or holding the locations of the equipment, areas that have already been burnt out black, so you know those are safety zones, etc. These are some images that are taken from the Southern Guide to Prescribed Fire that just show some different ignition techniques that are often used, and they're sort of different, there are different fire behaviors associated with them. This is a backing fire technique where if you see this black arrow here, that was the first place that fire was lit. And so it's slowly backing into the wind. You can see the wind is coming from the north here. So if it's lit on the south end of the unit, it slowly goes against the wind. And then fire was lit here off of that fire break. And then fire is being lit here by the person there. It looks kind of like a ninja or something. And it's slowly backing into the wind. As you can see, they have the sawdust pile where they would be really concerned about getting fire into that because it would act like an organic soil and burn for days and days and cause smoke problems. So you don't want to get fire in there. So the fire spreads slowly against the wind. Backing fire is good because it has low intensity, which means it has low rates of smoke emissions. And so it really dilutes the smoke emission over time. It has low fire severity, so you don't have to worry about crown scorch very much. There are a lot of things good about it. The bad thing about it is it's very, very slow. And so it's often hard to burn an entire burn unit using backing fire. And remember, you have from your authorization the mandate to have your fire put out and mopped up and no smoke, usually by the end of the day, so that you don't have smoke problems at night. So oftentimes backing fire can't be used because you need to get the fire done and mopped up to follow your smoke management guidelines. This is called a flanking fire, where fire is lit into the wind. And I like this ignition technique. We often use this. And it has the advantage that the wind is blowing in between these flanks that are being lit into the wind. And so it's sort of keeping the fire from crashing together. The fire kind of spreads into the wind, but slowly, but it's a little bit faster than a backing fire. So you can usually get the whole thing done and mopped up in time without having a lot of high fire intensity or severity. Intensity is the rate of heat release, and fire severity is the effects of the fire on vegetation. I have a little kind of cartoon schematic here showing a flanking fire and how it works. So this is the wind coming from the south in this case. So backing fire is lit first, and then the flank fires are lit on the side, and then they come together. So you can see it's kind of a safe way to do a prescribed burn, in that you've got the downwind area blacked out first, and then those flanks just kind of come together. It's also kind of good for wildlife too, because it allows animals to escape. You're not ringing them in anywhere. This is another ignition technique called spot firing. There's some other names for it, but in this picture, the people are lighting from the left to the right, and they're just dropping dots of fire on the ground, and they spread. And of course, you have a backing fire lit before you start doing that to have a safe zone downwind. In this ignition technique, you have wind coming down in between these spots, which kind of blows them apart or keeps them from spreading together very rapidly. And so this is another ignition technique that kind of minimizes fire intensity and severity. And also the fire is drawing wind into itself, and so the wind is kind of pushing against each of these spots, even though they're growing and expanding. So they're not crashing together. They're actually kind of fighting each other for air, and so it's a kind of a nice low severity way to put fire on the ground. And it's commonly used when you have to put fire over large areas. This is the kind of ignition technique that's done by helicopters and large units on agency lands where you have to burn 2,000 or 3,000 acres in one day. This technique is called strip firing, and it's a little bit more intense way of burning. Now, again, you would light the backing fire first, and then these strip heads would be lit perpendicular to the wind from the left to the right in this case. So you've got the wind blowing into these strips, which helps increase the fire behavior and the fire intensity. So you have the fire backing slowly against the wind on one side of the strip, but then you've got the fire spreading rapidly on the other side of the strip. And where those flaming fronts come together, you have pretty high fire intensity and fire severity. So this is a little bit more aggressive way of burning, which might be needed in certain kinds of vegetation types that aren't very willing to burn, and also if you just need to get the job done pretty quickly, because as you might imagine, this can cover a unit fairly fast. The most aggressive way of burning is called a ring fire, in which case you would light a backing fire on the downwind side, as always, to blacken out a safety zone, and then would light around the unit like so, and then you have wind being drawn in from all directions by that convection column, and the fire spreads very rapidly to the center, and then kaboom, you've got the big convergence of fire, very high fire intensity and fire severity, depending on the fuel types. I mean, you can only burn what's there, but typically this would be a way that you would really want to nuke something if necessary. Very rarely used in a whole fire unit like is shown in this picture, but we might use it locally in certain areas where, again, vegetation might be kind of resistant to burning, and we really have to put some heat on it to meet certain management objectives. So the tools that are actually used to light fire are various. The drip torch is kind of the standard tool for lighting fires, and it has a mixture of mostly diesel and some gasoline, so that it gives it a little bit of flame, but allows it to burn long enough to get fuel burning. And the fuel is poured over a wick that ignites the fuel as it comes out and then lights the vegetation. Pyro shot is something that is becoming a little more popular lately. It has these little balls, or they call them ignition spheres, or most people call them ping pong balls because that's what they look like. But they have ethylene glycol in them, and you can shoot them into the unit, and then they catch on fire. So sometimes those are safer than doing it other ways. Here's an ATV mounted flamethrower to the upper right here. We use those at tall timbers a lot of times, so it's basically the same as a drip torch, but you can drive an ATV while the flames are coming out, so you can light up a lot of fire line in a short period of time, which is sometimes important for larger units. Down here to the bottom left, there's an example of a airboat mounted flamethrower, same kind of thing, but they're burning a marsh from the water. A helitorch, something that's sometimes used in larger units, basically again a drip torch that's on a helicopter. And over here on the right, these helicopter ignition spheres, or ping pong balls as they're called, are good for burning large units. You can see where each of these balls have hit the ground and started a fire there. And most recently, they've started to develop UAV or drone technology for dropping ping pong balls or fire spheres. And so that's kind of up and coming, and people are really looking into that, which might be safer in some cases. So mop up, this is the end of the day when the fire needs to be extinguished, and the goal is always to extinguish all fire and smoke. Fire so that it doesn't spread anymore, of course, and smoke so that it doesn't continue to be a hazard, especially on roadways where if it stays close to the ground, it can cause traffic accidents, or it can smoke in smoke-sensitive areas. I haven't really talked about smoke-sensitive areas, but that's something that you always would put on your map on the authorization as well. So places like hospitals or nursing homes or schools or anywhere there might be people who are sensitive to smoke are taken into consideration when the burn plan is being made, especially the wind direction and all those different conditions that influence how well the smoke disperses. So mop up is always specified in a burn authorization, and it's usually required. It's pretty much always required by a burn authorization to happen by a certain time. And it's of course important for fire containment and air quality. If mop up isn't done thoroughly, then fires, especially if there's some duff or some organic matter or peat, they can flare up again and escape after you've left the scene, and that can sometimes be a cause of fires escaping. And of course, if a fire continues to burn after you thought the fire was out, then that can be an air quality problem, especially at night when the inversion layer comes down and you don't have much lift on the smoke, and the smoke stays close to the ground and causes problems. Observations are typically made during a prescribed fire and typically recorded on the prescription. And generally, the standard is to make certain observations hourly of the weather and of the fire and smoke behavior. This needs to be done because you have to stay within your prescription. You have to stay within those parameters that are set by the prescription for weather conditions and fire and smoke behavior. If things change during the course of the burn such that you're out of prescription, then the correct thing to do is to begin mop up immediately, to basically stop lighting and start putting the fire out so that you remain within prescription for all the reasons that we've talked about. During a fire, it's a good idea to record problems that occur so that you can figure out how to avoid those problems in the future. If there's spotting over, or if there are equipment failures, if there are other problems, communication issues, etc. After fires, it's important to make sure that the fire has successfully been contained. So after you've done mop up and you think the fire is contained, it's still very important to go back repeatedly to the same site and make sure that the fire is still out, because like I said, there can be certain types of fuels, especially 100-hour and 1,000-hour fuels like logs and duff, that can continue to burn and reignite the fire later if you're not careful. You want to keep checking on smoke behavior as well. Oftentimes we'll go back to the fire after the sun goes down to make sure we've put out the smoke well enough and there's not too much residual smoke causing problems on nearby highways or smoke sensitive areas. We want to know about fire effects. So it's important, we put on the prescription what our burn objectives are, but it's also important to see if we've achieved those burn objectives. And oftentimes we'll do what's called a post-burn evaluation. And there are lots of different ways that post-burn evaluations can be done, from very technical, like using GPS units to take observations at points throughout the unit, or having permanent plots or photo series, or they can just be fairly low key, like just going and making a narrative description of the burn site and to what degree you've accomplished the burn objectives. But this is very important for completing what we call the adaptive management loop, or seeing if, first of all, we accomplished the objectives of the burn, and if we didn't, then what needs to be adjusted about our prescription or about ignition techniques, about our approach to the burn that might better accomplish those objectives next time. So there are some challenges to prescribed fire. The public understanding and acceptance is always important in a democracy, of course, where you have to have the acceptance of the public and people who vote and influence the legislation about burning. If people don't understand all the benefits that we've talked about today, then they might just think it's irresponsible people creating smoke and causing problems or endangering the public, etc. And that might cause our leaders to start to turn against prescribed burning. Resources are needed for prescribed burning, of course. Money is always an issue, equipment, personnel, both for agencies and private organizations, and for private landowners who want to conduct prescribed burning but may not be able to afford it. If they don't want to do the prescribed burning themselves, they might be limited in their ability to hire prescribed fire contractors to do the burning. Expertise is a limiting factor in prescribed burning. Obviously, for all the reasons we've talked about today, people need to be very well trained, experienced, and competent to do prescribed burns. Liability is a huge limitation. It's the primary reason that private landowners are reluctant to conduct prescribed burns, even if they know they'd be very beneficial to their property. They're just, even with the prescribed burn acts and all the protection against liability, it just sometimes takes some courage to light that first match and to conduct those first prescribed burns and to feel competent in doing that. Insurance helps with liability, but it's pretty expensive for prescribed burning, not so much because burning is inherently dangerous as much as there just isn't enough actuarial data on it to really quantify the real risk. That's getting better over time, but it's still pretty expensive just because insurance companies don't know enough about prescribed burning to have good information on them. The wildland urban interface, as it's called, which just means the interface of things like highways and subdivisions and any kind of development with natural areas that have prescribed burning occurring on them, that interface is increasing all the time as just populations increase and development increases, especially in the Southeast. And once upon a time, if somebody lit a fire and it burned all night, nobody even noticed in the rural South, but the rural South is not nearly as rural as it used to be and becoming less so all the time, so that there are more of these smoke sensitive areas to be concerned about, more public who needs to be informed and educated, et cetera, et cetera. Air quality regulation has an influence at kind of the strategic level, how much burning is allowed in an area, how much is being authorized by the state agencies is influenced by what are the allowable amounts of smoke and pollution that's created by prescribed burning. And that's always kind of in flux in response to air quality inventories that are conducted by the EPA and state environmental protection agencies. And we don't have time to talk about how those inventories are done, but basically they try to figure out how much burning's going on, how much smoke's being produced, what's the nature of that smoke, and then that provides the information for sound policy to protect the public from excessive air quality hazards. Legislation and having an authorization system can be challenging. In the Southeast, for most states, this is not so much a problem anymore since we have pretty well developed prescribed fire laws that set up the parameters under which you have protection from liability. There are pretty good rules set for when you can conduct a prescribed fire and can't, and et cetera. Some states, especially if you go up into the Northeast or even some of the southern states, don't have very well developed authorization systems, and so that leaves people burning in kind of a legal gray area, which isn't a very happy place to be as a prescribed fire practitioner. It's much better to be in a place like Florida, for example, that has very clear guidelines for the conditions under which you can burn, training programs for prescribed fire managers, etc. So I'm going to stop there and leave maybe a little bit of time for questions. And I thank you for your attention. This was all very, not real deep, but I hope it was a good overview of the basics of prescribed burning. I'd be happy to answer any questions as well as I can.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. Once again, if you joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange Program with the University of Florida. We just had a great presentation on prescribed fire fundamentals from Dr. Kevin Robertson with Tall Timbers Research Station. At this point in our program, we would like to provide an opportunity for question and answer session with Dr. Robertson. So please type your questions in to the Q&A tool in Zoom, and we will try to get through them in the time we have remaining. It does appear that Zoom has opened up the opportunity for you to vote for other questions that people have asked. So if you see some other questions, you want to see if you can encourage the likelihood that we get to it, then you can go ahead and give it a thumbs up too in Zoom. So Kevin, let's see if we can get through some of these questions, all right? So here's one that came in early on, and the question is about what things can prescribed fire crews do to minimize areas being exposed to foreign invasive species or outside species contaminants. And specifically, this person mentions aquatic sources being brought in on equipment, but maybe even equipment bringing in things like terrestrial species such as kogan grass.
So this is what's always hard about webinars is I can't get clarifications on the questions very well, but it sounds like the concern is about equipment bringing in exotics. I mean, one really important thing to do is to make sure the equipment's clean all the time and to be aware of what equipment is going from what location to what other location. depending on the exotic species, fire can be a help to keep it out of an area, or it could also, promote species like Kogan grass. But I'm not sure if I understand the question exactly, but certainly keeping equipment clean and making sure not to move dirt of any kind or vegetation of any kind from one place to another is really important.
We had another question that has came in. Could you talk about, in your view, some of the most common causes of prescribed fire escapes?
Some of they vary a lot. One is just spot overs, like I mentioned. If conditions are drier than anticipated, then an ember can get out of the fire unit and start the fire over the line. If it's not being watched closely enough, if there are not enough people holding, then that fire can get large enough to not be able to extinguish rapidly. So that's what's really important about having enough personnel to watch the perimeter constantly throughout the fire to make sure that spot overs don't occur, because they're usually easy to put out if you catch them right away, but not so much if you wait longer. Another common cause of fire escapes is, like I talked about, the fire flaring up again after you've already left the area that was burned. If there's organic soil that continues to burn, which can burn sometimes even underneath a fire break if conditions are dry enough, and you've got some kind of continuous roots or organic matter that goes onto the fire break. Having adequate fire breaks is important for that too. Sometimes people just don't have in wide enough fire breaks, or they're not disked or plowed thoroughly enough to have exposed mineral soil to prevent the fires from escaping. All of those are probably the most common causes of prescribed fire escapes. Is just spotting over in dry conditions, escapes after you've left the burn, and inadequate fire breaks.
Here's another question that came in about ring fires. Could you talk about, are ring fires particularly detrimental to wildlife?
Yeah, and that's another reason we don't use them very often. I mean, things can get caught inside of there, whereas otherwise they could escape. Most wildlife are able to get away from fire even in that situation. Obviously, if they can fly, they can get away from the fire. A lot of species know to find a stump hole or a burrow or something to get underground, in which case they're usually safe because the heat is rising. But other animals don't do very well with ignition techniques that ring them in. Reptiles especially seem to be kind of susceptible, like snakes and turtles. So we try to burn. That's one reason I like those flanking fire techniques. So you always give a back door for animals to get out of there, and I think that's a good thing. On the fire escape question, one thing I didn't mention was unexpected weather conditions. That's another common cause of fire escapes as well. You can't always forecast the weather perfectly, and if there's a pretty serious change in wind direction or humidity and other factors, then fire can do things you didn't expect it to and get out.
We're at the top of the hour. I'd like to continue with the Q&A at this point, but I do want to make a note here that if people need to leave, if they are interested in applying for Society of American Foresters CFE credit for participating, I've posted the link to the form to provide your information to be eligible for 1 hour of CFE. So in the chat window, you'll see there's a UF Qualtrics link. If you click on that link, you can provide your information if you are seeking CFE credit. We had a number of folks who have increased the ranking of a question that came in about notifying state and local air monitoring agencies. So do prescribed burners, are they responsible for notifying state and local air monitoring agencies about their burns?
No, that's the role of the agency that gives out the authorization. So they work with the air quality agencies to make sure that they're on the same page. And that's one reason that the agencies, like in Florida, for example, do the high split modeling of smoke projections, because they want to stay within the regulations that are enforced by the air quality agencies.
So we had another question that came in about fire behavior prediction tools. Are there fire behavior prediction tools that you see prescribed burners using?
Yes, it's not used as much as just kind of plain experience and knowledge about what fuels are going to do what under what conditions. I mean, one reason that fire behavior modeling hasn't been used a lot by practitioners is that it just isn't very good, or it hasn't been up till now. And one thing that our fire science program at Tall Timbers, in conjunction with researchers at Los Alamos Lab and others, are working on is a new fire behavior predicting tool called QuickFire. Well, QuickFire is the one that people will be able to use when it comes out, and it's a version of FireTech, which is kind of a supercomputer model version of it. But it's really making a big leap forward right now, but it's not quite out and available to fire practitioners. But I think in the near future, we'll have tools that are worth using, we'll say.
If you're interested in learning more about fire tech, that would be the supercomputer based fire model or quick fire. We have recordings of webinar presentations on both of those tools on our Southern Fire Exchange YouTube channel. We have a number of folks who have asked questions about UAV ignition packages. Is that something that's available on the commercial market?
Yes, it is now. I haven't used it personally, so I can't really speak for it, but I think they're increasing in popularity and getting a lot of attention, and they are available.
Yeah, it's the Ignis system from a company called Drone Amplified. Has a package that I know that several states in the Southeast and other places across the country have purchased these systems to start experimenting using for aerial ignition applications. Interestingly, we worked with the team that formed Drone Amplified to do a webinar on their kind of early research and development of that process back about 4 years ago. And now they have a full-blown operational system. Mm-hmm. We have a question that came in. This is a good one for the Deep South for sure. Could you talk about Kogan grass and its effects on prescribed fire?
Kogan grass has a very positive effect on fire behavior, which is the reason that it's insidious, and it isn't harmed by fire at all. So, fortunately, most of the exotic species are excluded by fire, but Kogan grass is the key exception. So it pretty much has to be heavily herbicided repeatedly. There's really no other cure for it. And yeah, once it really starts to cover an area, then when it burns with really high intensity, and it's very difficult to put out fires in Kogan grass. You pretty much have to let it burn out and stop it at the edges.
We have a question that came in from Jim, and Jim says, aside from burning, is it better to mow annually or biannually, or to let it grow for 5 to 7 years?
So maybe, like everything, it completely depends on management objectives. So, mowing can be a proxy for fire in certain communities where frequent fire is needed to maintain them, especially herb-dominated communities. Sometimes you see species like bog species, for example, that would historically have been maintained by frequent fire, thriving pretty well in mowed right-of-ways under power lines, for example. What mowing doesn't do is consume the fuel, and so it typically, unless you're removing everything that you're mowing, it creates a thatch that stays on the ground, and so that's an issue in terms of not reducing your fire risk as much as you might want to. It causes the mineral soil to not be exposed like it would be after a prescribed burn, so that's problematic for reproduction by seed for a lot of species, just as example. So, in one way it mimics fire, but in other ways it doesn't mimic fire. So there's really no replacement for fire completely, but mowing can help.
And there can certainly be cases where it might be appropriate to mow and then burn as a way to alter the structure or the arrangement of the fuels prior to putting fire in.
Yeah, there are various combinations of mechanical treatments in burning, especially with fire reintroduction situations where the fuel structure might just be too volatile to throw fire into, and so it's not uncommon to do fuel treatments before putting in the first few fires until you can get to a place where fire maintains the system on its own.
There's a question that came in from James, and James is asking about fuel up-to-date fuel moisture information. Are there resources that you know of for people to get fuel moisture? I'm guessing he's looking for live fuel moisture uh, information prior to burning.
Live fuel moisture has not really had a very good model come out yet. There are various models. None of them are terribly sophisticated that I know of. We don't, I don't really use them, but I know that they're important for vegetation types where live fuel is the primary fuel, like in um, bog type habitats or flat woods where you've got volatile evergreen shrubs that are carrying the fire. But I guess I can't really help with that one.
And I think at this point we're going to wrap up. There's one more question here we'll get to from Miguel asking about hydrological management. He said you mentioned that in your presentation. Could you talk a little bit about the what you know about the effects of prescribed fire on water use in different systems or yield?
Yeah, like I was saying, the prescribed fire that maintains an herb and kind of low shrub dominated system tends to promote retention of rainwater in the soil that makes it available for the aquifers and for recharge to water bodies, um, as opposed to having a landscape that's dominated by especially broadleaf trees, but also pine trees that really take a lot of water very rapidly out of the soil and transpire it into the atmosphere. So that's the main effect, is just that herbaceous vegetation and shrubby vegetation, especially the kind that are in the southeast, are just by their nature, they have a high water use efficiency. They're kind of parsimonious with water, or they use water efficiently for producing vegetation, and then also allow more of the water to go to the aquifer into water bodies. This is being increasingly researched. Some of the research that's been done on this has been from the Jones Center, and we've done some hydrological modeling ourselves on areas using like the WEP model, for example, that the USDA puts out on areas that we've frequently prescribed burned as opposed to row crop agricultural areas or closed canopy forest. And we found from our modeling efforts the same thing, that a frequently burned area that's dominated by herbaceous vegetation but doesn't have a closed canopy forest does have the highest percentage of rainwater go into the soil instead of being released back into the atmosphere again.
All right, well, thank you, Kevin. It looks like we have run up to the end of our time, a little bit over, in fact. So if we didn't get to your question or you would like to follow up with Dr. Robertson, please see his contact information on the screen. So with that, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your presentation. And thank you, Scott, for your partnership through helping to put together this webinar series and getting this coordinated. And thank you everybody who joined us today, and folks online through Zoom and folks online through Facebook. We hope that this webinar will be helpful in your fire and air quality management programs in the future. Have a good afternoon, everyone.